Hey folks, Nathan here. Welcome to Nate's Favorite Deck Building Games. This time we take a look at a relatively new deck building game. So far there is just the main set, though right around the time that I'm releasing this, the second set, the first expansion, is being released. This is Shards of Infinity. It's actually by a team that includes Justin Gary, who you may know from the Magic the Gathering Pro Circuit or from the development of Ascension, a deck building game we've looked at a lot. He also wrote a recent book, Think Like a Game Designer, which we'll take a look at in a separate review, even though I don't usually review books. I figure, given his place in the deck building game community, it probably bears taking a look at. Anyway, this is their new game, Shards of Infinity, published through Ultra Pro Entertainment and Stoneblade Entertainment. And basically, this really plays very different than what we would have expected from the makers behind Ascension. Ascension plays along similar lines as we've seen to things like Star Realms, to the DC deck building game, and you gotta kind of extrapolate out from that to get the mechanics of something like Legendary. But they all have sort of similar themes, as we'll see in some cases here. But for a small, quick game, this is probably the most different from the core mechanics we've seen so far than any of the other ones we've looked at outside of Legendary. And Legendary, as we've seen, is a very complex game with a lot of moving parts. This all fits into one quick box and is available for 2 to 4 players right out of that box. The concept basically is this idea that there was this thing called the Infinity Engine, and it was this massive, powerful technological construct created by humanity. And like you would expect, absolute power wound up corrupting absolutely, and this reality warping power wound up corrupting the people who created it, who then used it to essentially lord over all of mankind, until after 1,000 years, humanity rose up and destroyed the Infinity Engine. The shards of it, the Shards of Infinity, hence the name, wound up going all over the world, and where they landed, it basically wreaked devastation. So now we're in a time period where 4 different groups, 4 different sects, segments, post-human groups, you might call them, are now rising to power, following leaders who have the ability to use these Infinity Shards as they're trying to collect all of them to bring together a new Infinity Engine and essentially gain dominance over this shattered world. It's a game that is a one-on-one combat, or in this case, an up to 1-on-3 combat game, because there are up to 4 players all trying to take each other out type of deck building game that, like I said, sort of deviates from some of the norms. And in doing so, it becomes pretty fun. As I said, there is only the core set right now. I would note, yes, that this is a playmat for Shards of Infinity. This is not a retail release, but you can find this whenever you see Stoneblade Entertainment out there promoting Shards of Infinity at different conventions. They usually have these for sale, and at Gen Con this past year, where James Wilder picked this up for me, at Gen Con this year, they actually were selling copies of the game along with the playmat, and you got a discount if you bought the 2 together. So keep an eye out at conventions if you want to play Shards of Infinity without using just a regular table. There are playmats available out there, though as we'll see, it doesn't necessarily have a place for everything. It basically has a place for the deck, the so-called center row, and that's basically it. Your banish pile, your pile for your cards, and so forth aren't going to be on the playmat itself, though that tends to be the case with most playmats for these games. So, what are we dealing with here? Well, of course, our rule book will lay it all out. It's not a super complex game, but it is, I would say, complex on the realm of maybe just one of the main basic sets of Ascension, without going too much in depth into altering mechanics from set to set to set. So, nice, quick rulebook, very quick and easy game to learn. Now, in this game, you represent one of the leaders of one of these 4 new factions that are rising. One of them is Homodeus. All right, basically, it's humans and machines as hybrids for survival. You'll be representing them through Decima. If you play as that character, we'll look at what exactly is on these character cards as we go along, but suffice to say there are going to be 4 of them. So Homodeus, represented by Decima. We have Kosin Wu, sort of looks like Apocalypse to me, honestly, who represents the Wreath, people who basically took refuge in the Void with a capital V and came back essentially changed, with it warping them. We have Volos, representing the Undergrowth, which is sort of humanity in the wilderness, and now it's sort of trying to rise back up and retake the planet for their nature god. And then we have Tetra, representing Order, or the Order. Basically, they're all connected digitally and are preserving the knowledge of humanity. Now, each of these, you'll notice, has a couple little counters on it and some information down at the bottom. So we have our name of the character, image of the character. Your health is tracked through a dial, and it's kind of nice that they actually start you out. Say you're at the lowest level, you're dead, right? So there's your skull. As you're adding health, it goes from red to orange to green, okay, until you get up to 50, which is the maximum health out there. So it's nice. As your health depletes, you see the color change to help give you an instant indicator of the situation. We also have a similar color coding down here to what is known as your mastery level. So we start with 0 in the black, work our way upward into the teens in orange, then yellow, and then 30, which is the ultimate level of it. You'll see there is basically the orange, or I guess yellow, kind of yellowy orange looking. It's yellow with red around it that gives it an orange tint, okay? So 2 dials that you're going to be keeping track of for your character as you play. And then underneath, they all have the same focus ability. Focus. Pay 1, we're going to find these are called gems. It's kind of like runes in Ascension. Exhaust, which is turning to the side, right? The focus ability requires the exhausting, okay? Gain 1, that is 1 mastery over to the side by turning your dial here. Okay, we'll look at what that actually means in a moment. And then each card has some flavor text down at the bottom. But 4 characters to represent these 4 different groups. And when you play, you are playing with one of them to start with. And I should note that you don't necessarily start exactly even, given the fact that this is a game that takes place around turns. They're not all acting simultaneously. There is a mechanic in place to sort of make sure that there's not a disadvantage to those who start later. So everybody starts with 50 health, but the amount of mastery you start with starts at 0 for the first player, 1 for the second player, 2 for the third player, 3 for the fourth player, assuming you're playing with all 4 players. So there is at least some balance to the fact that you got some players who are starting later. Now, one of the things I like about this game is that they have taken a different approach to the starting decks than most deck building games do. Usually, it's 2 different types of cards. It might be the DC deck building game where you've got 7 punch and 3 vulnerability, or maybe it's Ascension, right, where you've got 8 apprentices and 2 militia. Or perhaps we're looking at Legendary and we're dealing with our shield troopers and shield agents where we've got 4 and we've got 8. In this case, you've got actually 4 different types of cards in your starting deck as the game begins in the first place, though you still have the same 10 that you would start with in Ascension, so you're going to have hands of 5 cards each. The first card that's going to be in there 7 times, so enough for 4 players, is going to mean 28 of these, is called Crystal. Okay, it's an item, it's an ally, that's just keywords that are used for other things. Most of the cards in the game are either ally or champion. But notice here, it says +1 and has that little gemstone behind it. Okay, that is +1 gems. In this game, gems are the equivalent of runes in Ascension. They're what you are going to play cards to get and then spend to acquire cards from what they call the center row. We'll talk about that more in a second because I think that name is kind of bizarre for this particular game setup. But suffice to say, you get 7 of these, each that can give you 1 gem. Then rather than all of your cards giving you power, something to attack with, it's only 1 more out of your starting deck to bring your total to 8. And that's the blaster. Again, item ally, blaster, +1, that's their symbol for power. So the terminology in this case is the same as it is in Ascension. But then remember that whole thing on these character cards of mastery level that you slowly gain. Well, mastery is something that gets gained throughout the game. It doesn't just disappear or anything, though some things can harm your character and change the dials and all. But your mastery level grows as you play throughout the game. And what will happen is that it's kind of like Energize back in some of the early Ascension sets, in that it's a threshold that gets met. And once you've met that threshold, you can activate certain abilities on certain cards without it necessarily being that you're spending any of that. It's just you have a power threshold, and as long as you've met the threshold, you can use any abilities that trigger at that particular level. So one of the cards we also get into the starting deck is the Shard Reactor. Okay? Normally you play it, it says gain 2 gems, right? 2 of what you're going to use to acquire things. But once you acquired 5 mastery, once that dial reaches 5, you get 3 instead. Once you reach 15, you get 4 instead. An example of the type of card, 1 for each person's starting deck here, bringing the total to 9 in the starting deck. But just a card that is a good example for us here of the idea of how mastery is going to change the power level of the individual characters. And that is all important once we get to the last of the cards, called the Infinity Shard. Remember, each of these champions, each of these characters is supposed to be the leader of their faction because they can wield the power of the Infinity Shards that come from that Infinity engine. Well, here's an Infinity Shard. Okay, just the original Infinity Shard card here. You zoom it in a little bit better on the card itself. There you go. Initially, gain 2. Once your mastery level reaches 10, which is a third of the way up, gain 3 instead. Once it's at 20, 2/3 of the way up, gain 5 instead. Once you reach 30, ultimate mastery, you can't master any more use of the Infinity Shard's power, gain infinity. Okay, you're going to be using this power to attack the other players and their champions throughout the game. Champions are a specific type of card, which basically means that once you hit mastery level 30 and this card comes back up, when you draw a hand, you win on that turn because you will have infinite power to wipe out everyone at once. Kind of a cool way of ending the game on a powerful, tense note, because it's not just reaching 30 mastery, you got to pull this card up again. So others are looking at you with ultimate power, seeing you coming for them, but they don't know when you're actually going to draw the card and make it happen. I love that as a cool way to end this game, outside of just knocking out the other players normally. This, though, makes up the 10th card out of your 10-card starting deck, from which you draw 5 starting cards as your starting hand. Then we have a total of 80 cards that make up our so-called center deck. And it plays kind of like Ascension does, pretty much entirely the way that Ascension does when it comes to the center row, except for the fact that they still call it a freaking center row, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Because even if you're not using the playmat, the way that it's designed for you to set this up according to the instruction manual, the rules, is 2 rows of 3. Now, they're never treated as 2 separate rows, but it's 2 rows of 3 instead of a row of 6, or some games have rows of 5 and so on. So the center row is actually not, a row. The center row is this grid that's 2 by 3 of 6 cards. So we set up our center row as we start the game, and we've got 6 cards out there, and as any card is removed from the center row, it is immediately replaced from the center deck. In that case, it works a lot like Ascension rather than something like, say, the DC deck building game where you don't actually refill it until the end of the turn. These are immediate refilling procedures. Now, I got a few cards out here to show you examples filling up these 6 spaces. The green cards are Undergrowth. Wreath is purple. Okay. Homodeus tends to be sort of a tan meets silver meets gold type of color scheme. The bluer cards are going to be your order cards here. And I did put 2 out here specifically to point out a couple of promo cards that are available out there. The original promo card for the game, if you want to go look for it, is Gyan, or Gyan, I'm not sure how you're supposed to say it, Shardworm, an Undergrowth champion here. And then the newer one that was actually released right around the same time as the playmat at promotional events is Query Monk. So just in case you're out there trying to get a complete set, so to speak, of Shards of Infinity, there are 2 promo cards out there along with the playmat to hunt down outside of the base game. I tend to do that sort of thing for some of the games. Haven't started doing that for Legendary yet. Now you notice here the card layouts are similar on each, but there are some variations. So first, this is a regular ally card, okay? You're going to have a cost up here in the corner, a cost in gems, exactly like we would expect as a cost of runes in Ascension. Nothing particularly odd there. Title of the card, the thing that it gives you, some flavor text. It tells you what faction it is, tells you what kind of card it is, ally or champion in this case. But it also has something weird here that says Mercenary, okay? Mercenary cards are something that's unique about this game because you notice you got your 6 cards there for your center row. You got your cards you can acquire for whatever their cost is. 3, 2, 4, 6, 4, 3, whatever. You notice what's not there? No always available cards. Legendary has its Shield Officer. Ascension has the Heavy Infantry or the Mystic. DC deck building game usually has the Kicks, or maybe it's a Hard Light construct in one of the more recent ones. Nothing. Not even some kind of enemy to go after, because you're going to use your power to usually go after the other player's character or their champions, as we're going to see, rather than needing to go after some enemy in the center row. There are no enemies to go after in the center row with your power in this game. It's all about acquisition. In that case, it plays somewhat like Star Realms or Hero Realms tends to. But the key here is that, yes, you do have basically just the option to acquire something, but there is also a second option that is available. Any of the cards marked Mercenary, and it's hard to see it on that one. You can see it a little bit better here. Over the type of card, it'll say Mercenary, and it'll have like a red border going around it instead of a regular color-coded border to its faction. A Mercenary card can be played immediately, but you don't get to keep it. So typically in a deck building game, including this one, if I were to say pay 4 gems to get Query Monk, he goes on top of my discard pile. And later, when my entire deck has run out, I shuffle my discard pile to make my new deck, and I draw from it to make new hands, until eventually that card finally comes up again, and I can play it from my hand, right? But that means that if I want to get a powerful card, I won't be able to use it for a while because it has to cycle through my deck to get back into my hand first. Mercenaries work otherwise. A Mercenary, you get to play that card and use its ability immediately, the moment you pay its cost. And it is the same cost, but you don't get to keep it. Instead, as soon as your turn is over, it goes into the bottom of the center deck, so it cycles back again at some point if you wind up getting through that entire deck. Okay? So every single time you have the gems, the cash, so to speak, to use a card from the center row, you have a choice to make. You can get the benefit of the card one time immediately, or repeatedly, but at a later time if you acquire it and put it into your deck for eventual use. Kind of a cool way of allowing you to use things much more immediately than you otherwise would. It's something you don't tend to see outside of special specific mechanics in certain very specific situations in most other games, whereas in this game, it is a fundamental part of the gameplay. When you do take a Mercenary and play it like that, it's called fast playing the Mercenary. And I would note that the game doesn't have a whole lot of keywords in it, but you do have Unify, which is very similar to what we see with some of the mechanics in Ascension here, which is basically you do whatever if you've played another ally of that type or champion of that type or whatever, blah, blah, blah. Right? So basically focusing on one faction or at least a couple of factions rather than all the factions may be to your benefit if Unify abilities do come up. The only other real keywords to speak of are Dominion, which basically gives you an ability if you've played all 4 factions that turn, including the faction of the card itself and then the other 3. Then you have Echo, right, which basically gives you an ability if there is a card, usually of that faction, sitting in your discard pile. And you got Inspire, which tends to give you some ability if you have a champion in play. So fairly straightforward, easy to understand keywords, and typically the explanation is in the way it describes the ability. You don't have to memorize them the way that you have to in, say, Legendary. Now, let's take, for example, a champion card, right? So you'll notice that instead of saying something ally, it says the faction and champion off to this side instead of over to the right. Over on the right, there's now a health indicator here, but there's still a cost, still a name, still game text, still the flavor text, and all that sort of thing here, right? So Evocatus is an example of a champion. A champion, when you play it, doesn't go back into your discard pile at the end of the turn. It stays in play very much like, say, a location in the DC deck building game or a construct in Ascension, or maybe a base or an outpost in Star Realms. It stays in front of you. And most of them have an exhaust ability, but they all give you some benefit one way or another. So for instance, Evocatus, on a particular turn, you draw the card, it's in your hand, you play it. When you play this, draw a card. They don't all say that, but some of them say when you play this and give you some effect. And then once it's in play, including on that turn, exhaust, which again means tap, basically, for Magic the Gathering. Exhaust. Gain 1 power for each Homodeus champion you have in play, which would include that one here, okay? So that's an ability you can get at least once every turn, each time you're able to exhaust it. And if there's something that allows you to ready an exhausted card, you can then use it again if you wanted to, okay? But you got that ability turn after turn after turn after turn, And the only way to get rid of that ability is if the other player, when they're playing, builds up enough power through playing cards that generate power, right? The little red symbol like on here, generate enough power, and then instead of choosing to go after the character of another player, they go after the champion instead and wipe them out by knocking them out for this much health. And it does all have to be done at once. It's not something where the damage carries over turn to turn. You got to have the full amount and hit them at once, just like taking out a creature in the center row or a monster in the center row in Ascension, or taking out a supervillain or something in DC deck building game. Okay, but they stay out there in play unless you wipe them out by choice. And you'll notice that some of the cards, whether they are champions or allies, also have those mastery abilities. So in this case, for Gaian Shardworm, the Undergrowth champion with a health of 5, you put it in play and nothing specific happens when you first put it in play. It doesn't say anything like that, like Evocatus did. But we put it in play, and then once it's in play, we can exhaust it to gain 2 power and 2 health. That is health for your character. But if we have reached mastery level 15, you gain 5 power and 5 health instead. The actual term for that is the Mastery Threshold Bonus. Now, there's one other thing I would point out about the cards, but we're going to hold that for just a second because that makes more sense to talk about as we talk about the phases of play. So most of what I talked about so far happens in the so-called play phase. You play cards from your hand to gain either gems or power or health or mastery, right? So the silver thing, the red thing, the green thing, or the yellow thing. And to get other effects as you play the cards. If you have any champions in play, you can turn them, tap them, exhaust them to get their effects at the time. You can recruit any number of allies, champions, or mercenaries. Again, allies and champions going to your discard pile, at least when you first acquire them. Mercenaries being played immediately by paying gems for them from the center row. Any of the ones that are removed from the center row, whether we're talking mercenaries or otherwise, those get filled immediately. And once per turn, you can use the focus ability on your character to spend 1 gem to gain 1 mastery. So theoretically, no game should ever last more than 30 turns, though, by God, that is a very long game of Shards of Infinity if that is what winds up happening. Then your last option during the play phase is to then spend some of the power you've built up to go after those champions, like Gaian or Evocatus, if the other player has played them and is getting benefits from them turn after turn after turn. But you're trying to build up a lot of power on that turn, so you got to be judicious on when you use it to go after a champion, because then you won't be able to use it in the next phase. The next phase then is the attack phase. And any remaining power that you have, you're going to use that to go after the other player's characters, to attack them. And you can assign the power to whoever you want. Say you've built up 20 power, then okay, and that's not unheard of in this game. Say you've built up 20 power, you could assign them like 5, 5, 5, and then figure out, maybe you're going to use the other 5 initially to take out a champion ahead of time, whatever, right? But you get to choose where it's going to go. But after you've assigned where that attack is going to go, you cannot change it. And that's when the other thing on the cards comes into play. Because some of the cards that a player may have in their hand, right, because they've just drawn their replacement hand at the end of their turn and are sitting on that hand once your turn has come around, some of the cards will have this symbol. And that's what makes them kind of more like outposts in Star Realms, in that they are defensive when they are revealed, not discarded or something, but just revealed from your hand, okay? So let's say I assign 5 power to attack Ko Sin Wu over there, and he reveals this from his hand and has the shield symbol and 3, okay? Well, that means that this character blocks 3 of those 5 power from actually hitting Ko Sin Wu. Nothing happens to the character, nothing happens to the card. They essentially just deflect that damage so that only 2 gets through to Ko Sin Wu, at which point he has to use his little dial and move his health down by 2. So once you, the active player, have assigned the power to carry out your attacks during the attack phase, right, after you've already dealt with the champions back in the play phase, okay, then the other players reveal their shield cards, if they have any. You then assign any of the actual damage that gets through the shield cards, and then the attack phase is over and you move into the end phase. And basically at that point, any mercenaries that you've played, remember those are just yours for that turn, go straight down into the bottom of the center deck. Any allies that you've played, they just get played on that turn and go in your discard pile, so now they go into your discard pile. Any champions that you have exhausted that are in play get turned right side up so they can be ready for the next turn. Any champions you just played, they just stay out there like any of the other champions. Any unplayed cards that are still sitting in your hand, they go in the discard pile also. You can't carry them over from turn to turn. You draw 5 cards from your deck to make a new hand, and the turn is over. At that point, it proceeds to the next player and continues around and around and around until either one player is left standing from just normally beating the crap out of the other 3, or one player winds up hitting mastery, drawing the Infinity Shard, and uses that infinite power and wipes out everybody else on that turn. Either way, it's all about who is the last one standing. Now, 2 things I would note about the game beyond just what I've said so far. One is that, yes, one thing that is kind of a complaint about the game at times is the fact that all of our characters are essentially evenly matched in their focus ability. You would think that in a game that had specific characters, that you would have some type of differentiation between them with maybe different abilities, kind of like the superhero oversized cards that you have in the DC deck building game, or the champions that come up in some of the later expansions, or one later expansion at least, Dawn of Champions for Ascension. Instead, in this game, they all have the focus, pay 1 gem, exhaust to gain 1 mastery, and they all start with the same health, and the only thing that differentiates their mastery level to start with is turn order, nothing to do with the individual characters. That is something that Justin Gary has written about in some recent articles, talking about how they wanted to come up with a way to differentiate them and give them sort of special abilities, but it was very hard to balance initially, so they didn't do that for this first game. Relics of the Future is the expansion that's coming out right around the time that I'm recording this, and it introduces relic abilities, relic cards and such, which is going to address that powerful ability angle to the game. So that type of thing is coming. It is not present here. So other than just looking cool and different, there's really not a big difference in the starting set as to which of these characters you play as. It's just which of the little tracker cards you happen to pick up. Otherwise, doesn't really matter at all. Another thing I would note that is a little bit different from what we see in Ascension is that when you banish a card, when you're told to essentially put a card completely out of play, there isn't a unified banish stack like the Void in Ascension. Instead, each player has their own deck, their own discard pile, and their own banished stack. It's very rare that you'll actually go into the banished stack for anything, but you have your own as opposed to there being a collective one, if that winds up ever mattering within gameplay. That said, the glossary to the rules refer to the banish pile, so it could go either way. The main instructions say your banished pile, which suggests that it is a separate thing. So, generally speaking, a game that plays in similar ways to traditional deck building games. If you're familiar with the DC deck building game, or Ascension, or Star Realms, Hero Realms, you'll be able to jump into this pretty quickly. But I would say that some of these aspects, I think, make it unique enough to give it a try, even if you're kind of getting tired of the standard form of deck building games. It's 1 set right now, 1 expansion coming, so there's not a ton to look for right now. Even if you're looking for everything, there's only just the playmat and the 2 promo cards to go out and hunt down at this point. The threshold of mastery, yes, it's kind of like the threshold of things like Energize for transformations and whatnot in some of the Ascension sets, but it has some significant gameplay power to many of the cards, plus adds a powerful, cool winning condition to the game. It is more of a confrontational, direct assault type game, something that Ascension is not. The DC deck building game outside of confrontations or the rival sets are not. And we've got that cool Mercenary mechanic to go along with the champions and the shield cards, which I'm kind of glad to see are separate. It'd be very easy for them to just make the champions the ones that step in as shields, kind of like those outposts in Star Realms. But instead, you've got cards you can reveal from your hand, much more like the defense cards you would see in the DC deck building game. And then your champions act much more like constructs as opposed to defending measures and whatnot. It's a cool game. It's got a cool flow to it. I enjoy it. I kind of wish there was more of it out there, but hey, we've got that new expansion coming, so I am psyched for that. So again, this is Shards of Infinity deck building game. This is from Stoneblade Entertainment, the same people who brought us Ascension, and we'll of course be taking a look at that expansion, Relics of the Future, when it arrives.